Hundreds of people have gathered in the Red Square to commemorate the 60th anniversary of Joseph Stalin's death.
For decades, Stalin's sealed tomb remained one of the most guarded symbols of Soviet history. It was not just a burial place, but a locked chamber tied to power, fear, and silence. When archaeologists were finally allowed to open it, they expected a controlled examination of the past. Instead, the first look inside raised a question no official record had fully prepared them for. The tomb had stayed closed for years, but what was hidden inside it made the silence around Stalin feel even heavier. Stalin's burial history begins in two physical places. First, his body was displayed inside the Lenin Mausoleum on Red Square from March 9, 1953 until October 31, 1961. Then, after a direct Politburo vote, his remains were moved to a grave behind the Kremlin wall. Neither site has ever been opened for a full independent forensic examination, which is why the word sealed matters here. October 1961 brought the most important physical event in this burial record. Stalin's removal from the mausoleum happened at night, away from the public, under direct political orders. A small group of Kremlin security personnel and embalmers carried it out, but the full details of what they saw inside Stalin's section of the mausoleum were never released. The silence around that transfer made the grave more than a burial site. Kremlin wall access is not treated like an ordinary historical location. Any examination of Stalin's grave would require permission from the Russian presidential administration, placing it under political control rather than scientific access. For researchers, this means the most direct evidence remains locked behind authorization, not archaeology. The sealed tomb is sealed because the body is there, but the examination is not allowed. Russian archives hold another layer of the case. Guard logs, physician attendance records, and reburial committee documents exist from Stalin's final hours and the 1961 transfer. Some material has been released since 1991, but not everything. For historians, opening those records became the closest available substitute for opening the tomb itself. Historians, including Simone Sebag Montefiore, used portions of the Kuntsevo guard logs and physician records while researching Stalin, the court of the Red Tsar. Those documents showed a timeline that did not fully match the official Soviet version of Stalin's final hours. With the autopsy sealed and the grave restricted, those gaps cannot be checked against the body itself. The sealed grave is only the beginning. The real question starts with the night Stalin was found, because those missing hours are what turned his burial into a forensic problem. March 1, 1953, at around 10:30 p.m., Stalin's Kuntsevo dacha became the center of a medical emergency. Guards Krustalev and Lozgachev entered his room and found him unconscious on the floor, lying in a pool of urine. This was not a minor illness or a private collapse. It was the kind of condition that required immediate medical attention. Krustalev and Lozgachev did not call physicians after 10:30 p.m. They contacted the political command first and waited for direction from Beria, Khrushchev, and Malenkov before any medical help was summoned. The first doctors arrived the following morning, turning a medical crisis into a delay of several hours. Stalin's official cause of death was a major cerebrovascular event, where lost time can decide the outcome. Every delayed hour lowered his chance of survival, especially for a man with serious cardiovascular risks. The same men linked to the delay, Beria, Khrushchev, and Malenkov, became the leaders who inherited power after him. Dr. Vladimir Vinogradov, Stalin's personal physician, could not be called on March 1, 1953. He had been arrested in November 1952 during the doctor's plot, Stalin's campaign against doctors accused of threatening Soviet leaders. Vinogradov knew Stalin's blood pressure history, medication routine, and cardiovascular condition, but when the emergency happened, he was inside a prison cell. Kuntsevo's arriving physicians worked under the pressure of the MGB security system in 1953. A wrong diagnosis, a failed treatment, or a disputed medical decision could place them in danger. The sealed autopsy they later signed came from that controlled environment, and no independent forensic review has examined it from outside the Soviet system. Guard logs, physician records, and sealed Soviet archive material confirm the delay. Inside those same files was the autopsy, and its findings raised the next serious question about Stalin's death. Official medical records for Stalin's death were signed on March 6, 1953, by multiple Soviet physicians and became the foundation of the state account. The cause was listed as cerebral hemorrhage linked to hypertension and arteriosclerosis. At 73, with documented high blood pressure, the explanation fit the public version the Soviet government maintained for decades. Autopsy notes from 1953 described bleeding beyond the brain. Hemorrhaging was also recorded in the stomach and gastrointestinal tract, creating a multi-site pattern across the body. Forensic historians Edvard Radzinski and Jonathan Brent later focused on this detail because a normal spontaneous stroke explains cerebral bleeding, but not the wider pattern written into the report. Warfarin matters because this anticoagulant was available in Soviet-era rat poison and can produce the same kind of bleeding pattern listed in the 1953 autopsy. It can cause extensive hemorrhaging, bilateral bleeding, and damage in multiple organ sites at once. Physicians who signed the March 6 document understood the medical weight of those findings, but the sealed conditions around the autopsy left the implication unstated. Soviet forensic methods in 1953 did not include toxicological screening for anticoagulants such as warfarin. Even with the substance present, the autopsy could not have detected it through the methods used at the time. The document showed what doctors found inside Stalin's body, but it could not prove what produced the bleeding. Partial declassification after 1991 allowed historians to access portions of the Soviet archive and return to the autopsy record. Researchers kept coming back to the same detail: hemorrhaging in the brain, stomach, and gastrointestinal tract. The finding had been sealed for decades, and its clinical meaning placed pressure on the official explanation. Autopsy findings raised a sharper question about access. The next part leads to the men who controlled Stalin's food, drink, and room before his daughter arrived. Lavrentiy Beria, head of the Soviet secret police under the MGB/MVD, was among the first senior officials called to Kuntsevo after Stalin was found. Svetlana Alliluyeva, Stalin's daughter, later described the scene in 20 Letters to a Friend, published in 1967 after her defection to the West. When Stalin briefly opened his eyes, Beria dropped to his knees. When Stalin lost consciousness again, Beria stood up and walked away. Witness accounts around March 1953 describe Beria showing relief rather than grief after Stalin's death. His position gave him control over the dacha, the guards who found Stalin, the physicians who were summoned, and the security conditions around the autopsy. This matters because the same man reacting without visible mourning also controlled the system that managed the body, the room, and the medical record. Doctors' plot had already turned Stalin's inner circle into a target by 1952 and 1953. His own physician had been arrested, and the campaign was widening toward another purge of the Politburo. Stalin had signaled plans to remove men close to him, meaning Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and others understood that Stalin's survival could mean their own elimination. Warfarin mattered because Beria's office had access to the Soviet security network that handled chemical agents, laboratories, and supply chains. Through the MGB, Beria had institutional access to materials capable of producing the hemorrhaging pattern described in the March 6, 1953 autopsy. The record does not place a vial in his hand, but his position gave him access few others had. Beria's arrest came on June 26, 1953, less than 4 months after Stalin's death. The men who moved against him were the same Politburo figures present at the dacha. By December 1953, Beria was shot, and the charges did not mention Stalin's death. Historians, including Montefiore, have viewed this as the inner circle removing the man who knew too much. Beria's behavior, access, elimination, and the autopsy findings form the sharpest pattern in the sealed records. The next question is physical. What did the 1961 reburial place inside Stalin's sealed Kremlin grave? Kremlin authorities acted on October 31, 1961, after the 22nd Party Congress voted to remove Stalin from his place beside Lenin. A small group of security personnel and embalmers opened Stalin's section of the Lenin mausoleum at night under direct Politburo authorization. No public announcement was made, and the work was carried out under political orders, not public ceremony. Stalin's remains were moved from the mausoleum to a grave behind the Kremlin wall in 1961. The grave was covered with a concrete slab, sealing the transfer in a new location. A granite bust was installed in 1970, and since then, physical access to the grave has remained restricted under the Russian presidential administration. Internal Soviet records hold the key observations from that night. The committee recorded the condition of Stalin's body after 8 years of Soviet embalming, along with what personal items were present, if any, and what was placed in the new grave. Those reburial committee records have not been publicly released from the Russian State Archive, leaving the most physical details locked away. Reburial in 1961 moved the remaining physical evidence away from the public Lenin mausoleum and into a restricted Kremlin wall grave. Any biological material left from the 1953 death, any trace from the embalmed body, and any burial contents became harder to examine. Independent testing now requires government authorization, and that permission has not been granted. Undisclosed contents of the Kremlin wall grave remain part of the official gap. Records do not publicly confirm whether personal documents, effects, or items from the mausoleum accompanied the 1961 transfer. The grave's contents are therefore a documented unknown, created by sealed committee files and restricted physical access. Physical evidence from Stalin's remains may answer what the 1953 autopsy could not test. The next question is whether modern forensic science could still detect anything after decades inside a sealed grave. Partial declassification after 1991 gave researchers, including Montefiore, access to guard logs from the Kuntsevo dacha. Those records confirm the sequence. Guards found Stalin, called Politburo members, waited for authorization, and summoned physicians hours later. This documented timeline does not match the official Soviet account of prompt care after a stroke. Autopsy evidence from 1953, reviewed outside Soviet institutional control, showed the same detail researchers kept returning to: hemorrhaging in more than one part of Stalin's body. Edvard Radzinski and Jonathan Brent both focused on the multi-site bleeding pattern. A simple cerebrovascular accident explains bleeding in the brain, but not the wider pattern suppressed during the Soviet period. Toxicology limits created the deepest gap in the record. Soviet forensic pathology in 1953 did not test for warfarin or similar anticoagulants. Even if such a substance had been present, the available method could not detect it. The sealed autopsy described the bleeding, but it could not identify the chemical source behind that bleeding. Reburial committee records from 1961 remain another sealed part of the case. Those files would show what officials observed when the Lenin mausoleum was opened, what condition Stalin's body was in, and what was placed inside the Kremlin wall grave. The Russian State Archive has not made those records available to researchers. Independent forensic review has never happened outside Russian institutional control. No outside pathologist has examined the original autopsy findings directly, and no preserved biological material from Stalin's remains has been tested in a modern laboratory. The case therefore rests on historian analysis of sealed records, not laboratory confirmation. The records revealed enough to make the official explanation medically difficult. Proof remains locked behind restricted access, and only one modern test could close that gap. Modern toxicological analysis can now detect anticoagulant compounds in skeletal and mummified remains far older than Stalin's 1953 death. Contemporary forensic archaeology uses these methods to test degraded biological material, including cases older than 70+ years. The science exists to examine whether warfarin or a similar compound contributed to the hemorrhaging described in the autopsy. Kremlin wall grave access matters because it holds whatever biological material remained after the 1961 transfer. Stalin's body had been professionally embalmed before interment, which could help preserve tissue, bone, or dental material. Skeletal remains, preserved tissue, and teeth can hold chemical signatures long after death, making the sealed grave medically important. Access authorization comes through the Russian presidential administration, not an open scientific process. No researcher, institution, or government has publicly received permission to examine Stalin's grave for forensic testing. The barrier is not simply age, decay, or lost evidence. It is a controlled political restriction that continues into the present. Russian official history still rests on a natural stroke, an orderly medical response, and a bureaucratic delay rather than a deliberate one. A positive toxicological finding for warfarin or another anticoagulant would directly challenge the accepted account of Stalin's 1953 death. It would also reopen the question of Soviet leadership's succession after March 1953. Khrushchev's memoirs, published as Khrushchev Remembers in 1970, describe the final days at Kuntsevo Dacha in carefully protective language. Historians have viewed those passages as self-exculpatory because Khrushchev benefited from Beria's elimination and the political succession after Stalin's death. He had specific knowledge, and he had clear reasons to present events in his chosen version. The sealed grave is not just a closed burial site. It is the one place where the remaining evidence may still answer what happened inside Kuntsevo in March 1953. Official mainstream explanation says Stalin died at 73 from a cerebral hemorrhage caused by hypertension and arteriosclerosis. His known cardiovascular condition made this medically possible. Under this reading, the delayed care came from political fear and confusion, not direct interference, while sealed records and restricted grave access reflect Russian sensitivity around the Stalin era. Forensic Alternative focuses on the 1953 autopsy and its multi-site hemorrhaging, cerebral, gastric, and gastrointestinal. That pattern fits warfarin poisoning more directly than a spontaneous stroke. Political beneficiaries were present at the Kuntsevo Dacha. Beria had access and behaved unusually, and his later elimination gave the sealed records a sharper meaning without providing final proof. Speculative explanation says Stalin survived or that the Kremlin wall grave contains different remains. Evidence does not support that reading. Multiple witnesses saw his physical decline. His body was displayed for 8 years in the Lenin Mausoleum. The 1961 transfer was documented, and no credible record shows substitution or survival. Mainstream and forensic positions do not disagree over whether the autopsy exists. Both accept the document. The question is whether multi-site hemorrhaging in a 73-year-old hypertensive patient explains the full clinical picture, or whether an added cause is needed. Warfarin provides that added explanation, while Soviet conditions kept the implication unstated. Strongest footing comes from the combination, not one detail alone. The autopsy pattern, the delayed medical response in guard logs, Beria's behavior in Alliluyeva's memoir, and his elimination less than 4 months after March 1953 create 4 connected lines of evidence. The official account has never addressed all of them together. Forensic Alternative remains the most evidence-consistent reading, but it still depends on what the records imply. Physical evidence inside the sealed grave is the one part that could move the question beyond documents. Stalin's final room at the Kuntsevo Dacha became important because he was found unconscious there on March 1, 1953, after being alone. Food and drink service around that room was controlled by the security apparatus commanded by Beria. Guard logs recorded that medical help was withheld for hours, and the physicians later produced an autopsy under pressure, describing hemorrhaging that independent forensic historians see as inconsistent with a spontaneous stroke. Warfarin poisoning is not treated seriously because of rumor, but because of the 1953 autopsy itself. Edvard Radzinski, Jonathan Brent, and Montefiore's archival work all return to the same medical detail: bleeding in multiple sites, not only the brain. Their shared concern is that cerebral, gastric, and gastrointestinal hemorrhaging needs an explanation beyond a simple hypertensive cerebrovascular accident. Nighttime reburial in 1961 placed whatever remained of Stalin's body inside the Kremlin wall grave after 8 years of Soviet embalming. That material could include bone, dental remains, or preserved tissue. Modern toxicological analysis could potentially test those remains for anticoagulant compounds, including warfarin, which the 1953 autopsy methods could not identify. Opened archival records gave researchers guard logs, physician attendance records, and partial autopsy documentation. Those materials made the official explanation medically difficult, but not enough for laboratory confirmation. Still sealed records, including full reburial committee files, the personal effects chain of custody, and unreleased archive sections, may contain more evidence, but they remain unavailable. Most realistic conclusion points to biological remains inside Stalin's sealed tomb that could answer the question left open in 1953. Access remains controlled by a government whose official history depends on the question staying unresolved. The archive has been opened enough to make the medical problem specific, but not enough to settle it. Stalin's sealed grave may still hold the evidence needed to test the official account. The one examination that could resolve it has never been authorized. Modern toxicological analysis could test Stalin's remains for warfarin or similar anticoagulant compounds. The method is available in contemporary forensic science and has been used on remains older and more degraded than a 1953 death. A sample from bone, dental material, or preserved tissue inside the Kremlin wall grave could confirm whether anticoagulant poisoning contributed to the bleeding pattern. Russian authorities have never authorized independent forensic access to the Kremlin wall grave. Permission was not granted during the post-Soviet opening of the 1990s, not during later Western Russian historical cooperation, and not after published work by Radzinski, Brent, and Montefiore. The grave remains closed because access depends on the Russian presidential administration. Opened archival records gave researchers the strongest documentary problem. Guard logs showed the delayed medical timeline at Kuntsevo. Physician records showed the sequence of treatment. The 1953 autopsy described multi-site hemorrhaging in the brain, stomach, and gastrointestinal tract. Independent researchers focused on that detail because the full clinical record had stayed sealed for decades. Kremlin wall burial contains the physical evidence the archive can only point toward. Toxicological testing could confirm or contradict the warfarin theory supported by the documented hemorrhaging pattern. The Russian presidential administration controls the site, and without its approval, no outside forensic team can examine the remains or test the material directly. Stalin's tomb was sealed by the government that benefited from his death, and the records were sealed by the state he created. Partial access after 1991 raised a specific forensic question about March 1, 1953, at Kuntsevo dacha. The physical grave may answer it, but no authority with power to open it has chosen to allow the test. The unanswered question is no longer only how Stalin died. It is why the one examination that could settle the matter has never been permitted.